Our next lightning talk is going to be a very interesting one by Edith Luhanga, who is an assistant research professor here at CMU Africa. Edith, the floor is yours.
Hi, can you help me put up the slides, please? Thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody can see me well. So we had some interesting conversations in the panel on financial inclusion, and I'm going to talk about a study that we've been doing on people who own SIM cards that are registered under another person's ID. We're calling them third-party SIM cards, and how this impacts their financial inclusion. So here is a map of all the countries in Africa where you need to have an ID when you go to register your SIM card. You can see it's almost everywhere in Africa that you need to do this. And in just 7 countries in the world, this was a survey done in just 7 countries, 4 of which were in Africa, more than 200 million people are using SIM cards that aren't registered under their ID. So they're using third-party SIM cards. We ran this study to try and understand 3 things. First, why do people get third-party SIM cards? Second, how does having a third-party SIM card affect how they use digital financial services? And finally, how do we remove the need for third-party SIM cards? We didn't want to go into the study with any preconceived notions of what we'll find, so we ran a qualitative study. We interviewed 36 people per country in Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda, both rural areas and urban areas. And what I'm about to present are preliminary findings, so we're still going through some of this data. So to start with why people get third-party SIM cards. Most of the people we talked to were getting third-party SIM cards because they didn't have an ID. But surprisingly, it's not because they can't get an ID. Very few people didn't have an ID because they couldn't. Most of the people had already registered for an ID, but it was just delayed. So we're seeing people waiting between 6 months to 4 years to get an ID. And between that whole time, they don't have any other form of official ID they can use for the registration process. But there are also people who do have IDs who choose to get a third-party SIM card. And one of the more surprising reasons for this is the issue of privacy. When you do a mobile money transaction, you usually get a confirmation message that states the full name of the sender or receiver. And not everybody is comfortable about the idea that all these agents, all these people you're interacting with, basically strangers to you, know your full name, can sometimes even guess your ethnicity from the name. So they choose to use a third-party SIM card to protect their private information. So how does this affect how they use digital financial services? We've gone through the data of Kenya and Tanzania, and in both countries, people are actively avoiding using mobile money, either for savings or for microloans. There are subtle differences as to why they're avoiding this, but it all comes down to the fact that it's difficult to use mobile money services if you don't have access to the ID that was used to register that SIM card. So you either can't withdraw the money because you can't give the agent the ID, or if you lose access to that SIM card, you can't regain access to that mobile money wallet by going to the mobile network operator. So finally, how do we remove the need for third-party SIM cards? Over and over in the data, people are talking about how hard it is to get an ID in the first place, and this is one of the key ways you can enable people to have mobile money in their own names. Very few people are able to get an ID the first time they try to register. Most times it takes at least 2 attempts to get an ID. Why does this happen? So there are a couple of reasons. I'll only talk about the ones that are bolded. One of the things that's coming out in the data a lot is that people go to the registration place with an idea of what the process looks like, but then they get there and they're subjected to what they call immigration interviews. You're having to talk about where your father came from, and sometimes even 3 generations back on your father's side. And not everybody has access to this information at that time. But there are also issues that happen in the institution itself. Sometimes application forms run out, and so anybody who didn't get a form when they got there has to go back home. And sometimes you manage to fill out the form, you go to get your photo taken, your fingerprints taken, the technology fails, and you get sent back home. The people who did manage to succeed to register at the first attempt were usually people who didn't go to the office. They went to some kind of pop-up registration drive that was set up maybe in the village. And in these registration drives, they usually remove the immigration interviews and they'll ask people for fewer documentation. So overall, these are actual words people are saying in terms of how they feel about the registration process. It doesn't feel like it's treated as a right for all. If you're born to a single mother and you're not sure who your father is, if you're an orphan, if you're from a minority group that's maybe nomadic and you don't have that detailed family history going back generations, how do you pass those immigration interviews? And when you can't pass them and you don't get the ID, how do you then go to higher education, get a job? This includes waitressing jobs, things that we consider informal jobs, but also register a business. So it's not treated as a right for all. But also people are talking about the fact that the process doesn't seem digitized and there's no clear indication as to why not. We know that you can apply for passports online. Why can't you do the same for national IDs? And why can't you have an online ID card that you can use when you're waiting those 6 months to 4 years before you get your ID? So overall, we talk a lot about mobile money as being a solution for financial inclusion in Africa. The Findex data from last year is showing that 33% of people in Africa own a mobile money account, and the increasing rise of account ownership in Africa is because of mobile money. But what we don't talk about is that there are 18% of people who are using third-party SIM cards who can't use or won't use these mobile financial services because of the risk involved and the hardship involved because they don't have access to the original ID. So the two open challenges I want to leave you with today is first, we know ID processes need to have some due diligence. How do we keep that but still be inclusive for people who can't prove this generations of history? But also, what are some of the barriers that might restrict us from further digitizing the ID application processes, and how do we resolve this? So we already had the poster session. Some people got to speak to me, but I'll still be here tomorrow and later today to speak to you more about this. Thank you.